In India, rivers are so much more than just bodies of water, right? They're lifelines. They're woven into our culture, our economy. They're sacred. But here's the paradox. These very same rivers, these things that connect our country, have also become the source of some of our most bitter, long drawn-out conflicts. So, how can something that's supposed to unite us end up tearing us apart? Well, that's what we're going to decode today.
And that really is the central question, isn't it? It's the fundamental tension we're digging into here. See, in a federal system like ours, water is technically a state subject. But the problem is, rivers don't really care about political maps, do they? They just flow. So how on earth do you manage a shared and, let's be honest, shrinking resource without breaking the very fabric of the Federation? The answer to this, well, it really speaks to the strength of our entire union.
Believe it or not, the framers of our Constitution actually saw this problem coming from a mile away. And their solution? It wasn't some rigid, one-size-fits-all formula for sharing water. No, it was much smarter. They created a dynamic mechanism, a process for resolving these disputes. And that mechanism is Article 262. Now, I want you to think of this not as some dusty, dry legal text. No, for all intents and purposes, it's the official rulebook, the designated battleground for India's water wars.
All right, so Section 1, India's water wars, where we'll really try to understand the problem. Before we dive deep into the legal text itself, let's first get a handle on the battlefield. What exactly are we talking about when we say a water war in modern India? What's the core issue that Article 262 is created to tackle?
Okay, here's the textbook definition, and you'll want to get this one down. An interstate water dispute is a conflict between two or more states over the use, distribution, or control of rivers that flow across their borders. Now, that keyword, interstate, is absolutely critical. This whole constitutional setup we're talking about, it only kicks in when a river actually crosses from one state into another.
So what's actually fueling these fights? Well, it's pretty much a perfect storm. Think about it. You've got exploding populations, growing industries, all demanding more and more water from a supply that's, well, fixed. Then you throw in some old colonial-era water agreements that just don't make sense anymore. On top of that, nobody can agree on the basic facts because there's no reliable, shared data that everyone trusts. And the cherry on top, the incredibly potent and often explosive nature of regional politics. It's a really volatile mix.
Okay, moving on to Section 2, the Constitution's answer, where we'll break down Article 262. So, we've seen just how complex the problem is. Now let's look at the really elegant solution the Constitution provides. How exactly did the framers build a tool to navigate these, well, treacherous political waters? Let's get into the architecture of Article 262.
Now, Article 262 is both elegant and, frankly, incredibly powerful. It really rests on two main pillars. First up, you have Clause 1. Think of this as the power to create. It basically says Parliament can pass a law to set up a special body, what we call a tribunal, to sort out these water disputes. But then you get to Clause 2, and this is where things get really radical. It gives Parliament the power to exclude all courts, including the Supreme Court, from having any say in these specific disputes. Just let that sink in for a moment. The Constitution itself is creating an off-ramp from the regular judicial system, and it's handing the final authority squarely to Parliament.
Okay, this immediately brings up a huge question, and this is a classic trap area for aspirants, so listen closely. You might be thinking, wait a minute, don't disputes between states usually go straight to the Supreme Court under Article 13? And you'd be right, they do. So why this special exception just for water? Getting this distinction right is absolutely key to understanding the whole system.
So let's break it down. The difference is absolutely fundamental. Think of Article 131 as the Supreme Court's general ward for legal fights between states. But Article 262, that's the highly specialized ICU, built for one specific, very complex problem. See, the framers had this incredible foresight. They knew water disputes weren't just about law. They're deeply technical, right? You're talking hydrology, engineering, crop patterns, all sorts of stuff. And they believed a special tribunal, full of experts, could handle that kind of techno-economic complexity way better than a generalist court, even one as important as the Supreme Court.
All right, Section 3, how tribunals work. We're going to see the legal framework in action. So we know Article 262 gives Parliament the power. The obvious next question is, what has Parliament actually done with that power? Let's check out the legal framework that's been built.
Well, using that power, Parliament passed two key laws back in 1956. The first one is the real heavyweight, the Interstate River Water Disputes Act. This is the law that actually creates the tribunals we keep talking about. Then there's the second one, the River Boards Act. This was supposed to be for proactive stuff, cooperation, managing rivers together. But honestly, it's a classic case of a law with amazing intentions that has, for all practical purposes, just gathered dust on a shelf. It's barely ever been used.
Okay, so let's walk through how this is supposed to work in the real world. Step 1. A state feels it's getting a raw deal, so it goes and complains to the central government. The center's first job isn't to create a tribunal. It's to try and get everyone to talk and negotiate a deal. Now, if, and this is a big if, that negotiation fails completely, then a temporary or ad hoc tribunal is set up. This tribunal acts like a court, digs into all the evidence, and then gives its final decision, which is called an award. And once the government publishes that award, it's supposed to be binding on everyone, with the same power as an order from the Supreme Court. That's the theory anyway.
Which brings us to Section 4, why the system falters. Let's look at the gap between intent and reality. So, if the system on paper looks so neat and tidy, why do we constantly hear about states fighting over water for decades on end? It's time to analyze that massive gap between what the Constitution intended and what's actually happening on the ground.
I mean, just take a look at these timelines. The Cowary Tribunal took 17 years, 17, to give its final award. And the Ravi Bias Tribunal set up way back in 1986, and it's still going on. We're not talking about legal cases here. These are generational conflicts. Think about it. A farmer who was a young man when a dispute started could literally be a grandparent by the time it's resolved. This crippling delay is without a doubt the system's single biggest failure.
But honestly, the delays are just the tip of the iceberg. The problems underneath are way deeper. Tribunals can waste years, literally years, just fighting about basic data, because there's no single neutral source of information that everybody agrees on. And then, even when an award is finally given, you've got a whole new fight on your hands: enforcement. States will use every trick in the book, politically and legally, to avoid implementing the decision. The entire process just gets hijacked by politics.
So, this leads to the million-dollar question, right? If the whole tribunal system that Parliament set up is so flawed, can the Supreme Court, the ultimate guardian of the Constitution, just step in? Even with that very clear bar in Article 262? Now, this is where we get into some really fascinating and nuanced constitutional law.
And here's the brilliant distinction the Supreme Court itself has carved out over the years. It has said, look, our hands are tied when it comes to the substance of the award. We cannot second-guess the tribunal on how much water each state gets. We are not an appeals court for this. However, the court can step in on other grounds. For instance, if the government is taking forever to form a tribunal, or if a state refuses to implement a final award, or, crucially, if the fundamental rights of citizens are being violated, then the Supreme Court can and will intervene. So the door to the court isn't completely locked, it's just a very specific keyhole.
Let's get into Section 5, reforming the flow, and look at the path to a better solution. Okay, so we've established the system has some major problems. Acknowledging that is step 1, but what's the way forward? Let's dig into the major reforms that are on the table to try and make this system work the way it was supposed to.
The biggest idea, the one everyone talks about, is getting rid of the current system of setting up a new temporary tribunal for every single dispute. The proposal is to have one single permanent tribunal with different benches. Why? Well, the idea is to build up expertise over time, have some continuity, and for heaven's sake, get decisions out faster. And this would be backed up by 2 other critical changes: putting in place strict, unmissable deadlines for decisions and creating a neutral, central agency for water data so we can stop arguing about the basic facts. And this quote from the famous Sarkaria Commission, it just perfectly sums up the whole philosophy. It says that going to a tribunal should be a last resort. It should only happen after every other option has failed. And that's the core idea, really. A tribunal is the nuclear option. The real, sustainable solution is to get better at talking, at negotiating and mediating, to build a culture of cooperation so that these fights never have to go to a tribunal in the first place.
All right, let's wrap this up with some quick revision notes. The absolute key takeaways. 1. Article 262 gives power to Parliament, not the judiciary. 2. The 2 big laws are the Interstate River Water Disputes Act and the River Boards Act, both from 1956. 3. The biggest problems are massive delays, issues with enforcement, and politics. 4. Remember, the Supreme Court can't touch the substance of an award, but it can step in on related legal questions. And 5. The main reform idea floating around is a permanent tribunal. There you go. That's the whole thing in a nutshell.
So I want to leave you with one final thought,
We spent all this time talking about laws, articles, and tribunals, all the legal machinery. But at the end of the day, these water disputes aren't just legal problems. They're about politics, they're about regional identity, and sometimes they're about sheer survival. So the big question to really chew on is this: can a perfectly reformed legal structure ever truly solve a problem that is so deeply rooted in our politics and our history? That's something to think about.
If you like this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the channel. Thank you.